Thank you very much, everybody. It really is wonderful to have been invited to be here, and I feel I must say a mixture of gratitude for the privilege of being present just now at such an incredibly rich and various dialogue, tinged with just a hint of resentment that I have to follow it. I'm going to be talking about the privacy of the self and a culture of exposure. So, we've seen controversies and anxieties around privacy explode in recent years. Over the last 6 years in the UK, scandals around media intrusion have proliferated, culminating in the protracted Leveson inquiry into the culture, conduct and ethics of the British press. More recently, and especially since the Snowden revelations, these anxieties have run alongside an increasingly fierce debate over the scope of state and corporate intrusion and control over our private data. Much of the debate and commentary on privacy issues in recent years has rightly been focused on these phenomena and the legal, political and technological dilemmas they raise. But framing the debate in terms of the ways state and non-state agencies are menacing our privacy... Sorry, I keep using the UK pronunciation, you'll forgive me. Are menacing our privacy rights risks simplifying our complex and ambiguous relationship to our privacy. To portray the private self today merely as the victim of malign external forces is to ignore the many daily ways in which we collude in the erosion of our own privacy. Only if we attend to how intricately the technological and political are bound up with the psychic and cultural dimensions of private life can we discern how we are at once victims and perpetrators of its erosion. This ambiguity might shed some light on how muted and uncertain public understanding of and protest against state and corporate surveillance have been. These offences against privacy are all too continuous with the intrusive culture in which we've come to live and breathe. Perhaps then it's hard to generate real outrage against a phenomenon with which we've become so complicit. We are increasingly swept along by a drive towards total and permanent visibility, which is closing down the spaces in which a private self can preserve and cultivate itself. An imperative no less powerful for being tacit coaxes us into dragging every region of ourselves, the selves of others as well as my own, into the light. Privacy is for pedos, a British tabloid journalist, Paul McMullen, notoriously remarked at the Leveson inquiry in response to a question about his intrusive techniques of phone hacking, telephoto lenses, stealing all kinds of data and so on. Fundamentally, he elaborated, no one else needs it. Privacy is evil. It brings out hypocrisy. If we're to confront the contemporary crisis of privacy head-on then, we may just need to recognise how much, for all its pantomime villainy, McMullen's statement runs with rather than against the grain of our culture. Our avid consumption of and demand for the perpetual drip feed of reality TV, celebrity gossip, and the more ordinary forms of continuous self-revelation on social media hints at how privacy, the existence of a region of life withdrawn from the public gaze, has precisely become an evil, an obstacle in the way of our right to know whatever we want about whoever we want. Nowhere is this tacit conviction played out more than in our relationship to celebrities. By intruding into their bedrooms, their bodies, their bank accounts, the media and its consumers, that is more or less all of us, seek to penetrate and destroy not simply the privacy of a select few, but as McMullen himself hints, privacy itself. The very existence of a life unseen is a scandal to be eliminated at all costs. The problem being, of course, that there is always a life unseen. In our frenzied peeping into the lives of others, then, we play out the belief that with a sufficient glut of light, nothing will remain unknown to us. Psychoanalysis, at least as I understand it, hints that this war on the unknown in the other might be a displaced rage against the unknown in myself. It intimates depths and excesses in us of love and hate, of vulnerability and rage, fear and voraciousness we neither can nor want to know about. It insists that my inner life always exceeds any known quantity, and that this unknowability is a fundamental human predicament, a truth of every human time and place. But different histories and cultures will bear the burden of this truth very differently. Our own culture of tacitly coerced self-externalization demands that we view ourselves as reducible to its external manifestations, to the pictures we can take of it, the data we can share about it, reducible in short to the self we can put on display. Social media facilitate the sharing of our deepest personal intimacies from birth to sex to grief. We are enjoined to create and broadcast life logs, rolling updates of some or even all of our lives. Far more than one of the many arbitrary diversions of contemporary life, the life log is the purest distillation of the relationship we're forging with our own privacy. Under the name quantified self, life logging is taking on the dimensions of a distinct tendency and philosophy of our own moment. Its basic premise is that we can employ a limitless array of technologies scaled to the minute dimensions of our everyday lives to resolve the essential problems of selfhood, bodily and mental. Wearable wristbands or smartphone apps measure, monitor and share the data of our daily bodily and neurochemical lives. Cholesterol, mood swings, no doubt soon enough our serotonin and dopamine levels, as though the self were reducible to this sum of numbers. Some loggers use wearable cameras to record and instantly upload to the web every detail of their waking lives. Such experiments in radical transparency sharp a zeal to dispose of any excess or remainder in the self, to perceive ourselves as indifferent instances of a generalized calculus. But this is to assume, along the lines of the chillingly resonant tech executives at the centre of Dave Eggers' recent novel of our dystopian present, The Circle, that privacy can simply be abolished by a sufficient glut of transparency. Psychoanalysis would suggest otherwise. The private self can't be reduced to the circumscribed spaces we typically speak of as private. The home, the bank account, the hard drive, the external tokens of what we might call bourgeois privacy, the privacy of what I do or what I own. We don't, after all, cease to be private when we leave these spaces and enter the public realm. And if I have any kind of agon with Hannah Arendt on the question of privacy, it's precisely around this particular point, the way in which privacy is circumscribed and therefore a space we can leave as soon as we enter the public realm. And I think it's interesting because the wonderful Auden quote on the bag, I think, comes from a letter to Arendt and is actually a very concentrated correction to her notion that one leaves private space when one enters the public, that is the relationship between them. In talking about private faces in public spaces, I think Auden is talking about the way in which we insinuate privacy into the public present. And this seems to be a much more kind of intimate relationship between the two terms than one in which we think of them as two external realms, two externalized spaces. So in other words, we don't cease to be private even when we broadcast our every waking moment to the world. The private self isn't some discrete entity we can leave behind, but a perpetual presence, concealed and revealed in the minute aspects of our being. Walking, smiling, speaking, writing, joking, eating, weeping, listening, our private self is diffused in all the ways we express it, and so it isn't reducible to any of them. It's concealed not so much behind as in the face we show the world. I see the two worlds I occupy, the literary and the psychoanalytic, as intrinsically at odds with the imperative of permanent visibility governing our culture. Not that this imperative is born with the advent of tabloids and the internet. In one of the most powerful and prescient stories of the private self and its exposure, the Scarlet Letter, the conflict between the need to conceal and the drive to unmask the self is, of course, located in Puritan New England. Hester is ushered onto the scaffold for bearing a child adulterously and paraded. The embroidered Scarlet Letter, I'm saying this to an American audience, which seems completely ridiculous, but just in case you didn't know the plot. The embroidered Scarlet Letter glaring from her chest before a baying crowd. I'm just picking out one detail here, which is that the beadle proclaims the righteous colony of Massachusetts where iniquity is dragged out into the sunshine. There was a great movie recently where, I can't even remember which one it was, but the mother of a high school student is talking to her daughter, and she says they're reading the Scarlet Letter, and she says, "Really? You'd think they'd have written another book by now." Anyway, holding her baby, shaming evidence of this iniquity, Hester is forced to bear the heavy weight of 1,000 unrelenting eyes. But the glare of 1,000 eyes and of the sunshine itself fail to ensure the triumph of Boston's pious light over Hester's corrupted darkness. On the contrary, Hawthorne notes, and I think this line is extraordinary and, one to put alongside Arendt. On the contrary, Hawthorne notes, in the face of her lush beauty, the world was only the darker. Her inner self is rendered not more but less obscure by the drive to unmask it. For all the penetrative force of its 1,000 eyes, for all its concentrated focus on her heart, the crowd cannot see what it is looking for. Just how far is the profane glare of today's TV cameras and telephoto lenses from the pious light of Hawthorne's Puritan crowd? Do they not share the same zeal to purge the self of its secrets, the same hatred of the self's dark recesses? Our culture, I'd suggest, is as heavily policed as Puritan Boston's by beadles dragging our iniquity into the sunshine. Literature, as the example of Hawthorne suggests, allies itself with Hester over the beadle, with the preservation of the self's essential ambiguity over its enforced transparency. We turn to literature as an antidote to the quantification of the self, for a sense of the inner life is in excess of any laws or metrics or principles under which it could be subsumed. And it is in this sense I want to argue that the defence of privacy is tied to the defence of imaginative life. At the end of 2014, an international group of writers, including Don DeLillo, Arundhati Roy, Dave Eggers in fact, drafted a petition decrying the escalation of state surveillance and calling for an international digital Bill of Rights. Well, we might ask why writers should have any more distinct contribution to make to this debate than, say, florists or basketball players. Well, in one sense they don't, insofar as privacy is an essential dimension of any and every human life, to which no one has any more right than anyone else, certainly not by virtue of their profession. But if privacy has become such an urgently live issue for writers, it's because privacy is the air imagination breathes. At stake in the incursions of the state, the media and corporations into our everyday lives is the right to an inner life as much as to the protection of our personal data. A self coerced into permanent visibility will come to feel constrained not only in what he can say, but eventually in what he can think and imagine. In externalizing the self, a surveillance society, not only the persecutory monitoring of the totalitarian state envisioned by Orwell, but the more tacitly imposed, pseudo-benign mutual monitoring of our social media culture, threatens our interiority, our right to a private self that ensures we can never be fully transparent to ourselves or to our others. In a culture driven to render us ever more transparent to one another, literature and art may be among the few spaces in which to keep hold of this understanding of the private self. Without an implicit claim to privacy, to an external and internal room of one's own, there can be no art. From the earliest days of the psychoanalytic movement, literature and psychoanalysis have shared a mutual fascination and no doubt too a mutual suspicion. I see the source of that mutual fascination as their shared sense of the essential privacy of the self. Each strives for a deep knowledge of the self, but premises that striving on a recognition of its limits. What I can know about myself or anyone else is conditioned by what I can't. In the interpretation of dreams, Freud famously speaks of the navel of the dream, the spot where it reaches down into the unknown. It's the spot where the master of the analyst runs aground, where she recognizes something in the dream has to be left obscure. Now, Freud's intuition of this spot of obscurity, which I think is often passed over in the popular image of Freud that circulates as one of the great unmaskers. But his intuition of this spot of obscurity has a peculiar and urgent resonance at this juncture in our history. In a culture of coerced visibility which assigns meaning only to what can be seen and measured, how is this region of obscurity in our dreams and in ourselves to be valued and protected? Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that very interesting paper. I have a few questions for you. You touched on so many issues that I think are worthy of more thought, but I'm going to focus on one specific issue that also came up yesterday several times, but especially in the panel with Kate Crawford and Uday Mehta. And that's the question of what kind of self we're talking about and that we're trying to capture with these kinds of measuring techniques and this culture of exposure that you're talking about. So you say on the one hand that our current culture demands that we take this data-driven picture of ourselves as the real self, and that we reduce our notion of the self to these objective measures. But at the same time, you also say that the efforts to define the self in this way are doomed to failure because psychoanalysis points to another vision of the private self, which is something that is not located in a particular space that can be left behind when we go in public. It's something instead that's present at all times within the public self, and it conditions the ways in which we present ourselves in public. And you wrote and you said, it's concealed not so much behind as in the face we show the world, which I thought was interesting. And so what that means is that we are hiding the private self always by showing it, in fact, in various ways. And then that also means that our efforts to show more of our private selves or see more of your private self or someone else's private self are never actually going to show more, really. Or at least we're never going to reach this point of full transparency because we will always be simultaneously hiding and showing in various configurations. So from there, I want to make an observation about something important that I think is an implication of what you said. And then I'll finally have a question. So the implication is that we can't take this supposedly objective data about ourselves or about other people at face value. Data is meaningless on its own, and it needs us to interpret it and to ascribe meaning to it. And that's important on many levels. One thing that you and I discussed yesterday, actually, after David Brin's talk, was the issue of police body cameras and also our legal surveillance of police action with our cell phones. And David invested a lot of faith in these technical solutions to what is ultimately a question of power relations between human beings. And he says if the police smash your camera, the answer is more cameras. If they smash your camera and pretend it was an accident, the answer is still more cameras. And on one level, I think he's absolutely right, and I totally agree with him. But on a different level, I question whether the police even need to smash the camera because the actual data doesn't matter if people see it and they just don't care. And what I mean by that is that they can interpret it, they can rationalize it. It's possible, in other words, to see something and convince yourself that you've in fact seen something completely different. And you can convince yourself in a way that seems logical to you. And that's what many people, I think, believed they were seeing, especially, in the Eric Garner case in New York City, which was the chokehold police case, right? And even if you completely disagree with that analysis of that specific case, if you think that that video showed, did not give us at all unequivocal evidence of wrongdoing on the part of the police, it's still necessary to raise this possibility that that could be the case in the future in a different case. And I think that that's important because it absolutely raises the question as to the degree to which technology can be used for emancipatory purposes, at least on its own, in the absence of other kinds of changes in power relations that are going along with it. So technology can help change structural racism, but not on its own, I think, for example. But I also think there's a really positive implication here in all of this, which is that the technological determinists who are doomsday preachers are wrong. They can't be right. Because we will never rationalize ourselves completely, to use Max Weber's concept. We'll never completely capture the self using scientific behaviorist means. Because information produced in these ways does not carry with it its own meaning. It needs us to bestow meaning upon it. And given that that's the case, then, I want to hear more from you about what's at stake, because it seems like there's this built-in protection of the private self in this kind of interplay of human drives that you're describing. And so what's different about your opposition to the culture of exposure from resistance against things like psychology in general, for example? And I'm talking about the fact that people don't want to be pathologized and they don't want their imaginations to be reduced to the interaction of chemicals or even the natural drives that Freud describes, that you talk about, that you deal with in your practice. And I think that psychologists would respond to that, and do respond to that, hey, we're not trying to reduce you to these scientific elements. We're trying to provide you with further tools so that your autonomous self can realize your own life according to your imagination using these tools. So why is it that, you know, my Fitbit bracelet here isn't just a tool rather than a way in which I'm trying to replace myself with this externalized objective measurement of it?
Okay, thanks. There's so much there. I would quite like to try and follow the track of the question, and maybe just start actually with a slight proviso, which is yes, I mean, I point to psychoanalysis as offering a different account of selfhood than, say, the quantified self version. But importantly, I don't locate it in any sense exclusively in psychoanalysis. It's very important that psychoanalysis is part of a much longer and much broader dialogue which explores a multi-layered conception of selfhood. Psychoanalysis has no monopoly on an understanding of the ambiguity and the doubleness of the self. And I think it's useful, in a way, coming out of literature and the history of ideas, to have that kind of humility when speaking in the name of psychoanalysis. But the next point was, you know, your reference of the talk to the debate yesterday between Kate and Adai, which I found really fascinating, partly because I felt the pull of a kind of interior struggle listening to it, which I think you picked up really nicely is present in the talk itself. Maybe it's present in the book itself. So there is a kind of more polemical or critical understanding of a culture of exposure, intrusion, surveillance that Kate was putting forward. And on the one hand, yes, I'm making the point that the scope of the private self is being circumscribed, it's being potentially asphyxiated by the ways in which we are being kind of coerced into self-externalization. And on the other hand, I'm pointing, a bit like Uday really, to some dimension in the private self which doesn't belong and doesn't require the darkness of a private realm, that is carried everywhere, and that can be cultivated even when somebody is looking at you naked, in the privacy, the so-called privacy of your own bedroom, or even if you are in public. You know, that vision, which I found incredibly powerful, of Gandhi conducting a profoundly private conversation with himself, undergoing an interior journey into the depths of his own soul in front of hundreds of thousands of followers. So how does one kind of square these two versions? I think it's right that there's a dimension of the self that is ineradicable, and that one doesn't sort of get rid of interiority by forcing externalization. On the other hand, I do think it matters what kind of environmental provision there is for the cultivation of a private self. I don't think, and this is where I suppose I find the sort of the Gandhi version that Uday was putting across both compelling and just a little too heroic for me. I mean, is it that everybody can't be Gandhi? I don't know, but I do feel that there are a set of conditions that need to be in place.
It seems to be denying the existence of all these structural factors.
And it you know, if one talks to, you know, I spend a lot of time talking to young people, and I pick up a kind of recurring and very deep-seated anxiety about the ways in which the cultivation of a self that they show the world, and which they feel obliged constantly to kind of shape in conformity with what other people would want, takes internal resources and time and energy away from the cultivation of the self that they don't yet know they want to be. And so while I think that there is that ineradicable dimension of the self that can't be killed, I do think it can be desiccated. I do think it can kind of be starved of the oxygen it needs.
Yeah, that's great. All right, let's take a couple of questions from the audience. In the very back.
Hi, thank you for a very compelling presentation. I kind of wanted to push back against your critique of Arendt a little bit on the basis of a couple of conceptual distinctions that she makes that didn't seem to be accounted for. One is the distinction between the who and the what of a person, right? The who being the self that's revealed in public action, the real substance of what a person is, and the what being the things that we can say about them. She's half Mexican, you know, she's a student at this or that place, she's a mother, she's a daughter, whatever, you know, whatever that can be said about the person externally. And the other is the distinction between publicity and sociality. Right? It seems to me that the kinds of exteriorization that you're addressing really pertain much more to Arendt's notion of the social than to her notion of the public. And that as I read her, she suggests that the who that we develop in private is not, doesn't disappear when we engage in public action, but rather, to the contrary, is precisely the who that is revealed in that action. The difference being that when we act, we no longer have access to the two-in-one that gives us access to that self, and rather it becomes something that is seen by others. And so I wonder if that's consistent. I haven't read your book, but I look forward to reading it now. I wonder if that's consistent with your reading, or if there's still basis for complaint there.
Yeah, thanks. That's terrific. I guess one of the things that I was doing a bit telescopically by introducing the whole quantified self movement is to ask the question of what happens to the self and to its possibilities in a culture which wants really to collapse the who into the what. So in order to maintain a meaningful distinction between those two, there has to be some sense culturally that the distinction between them matters. And I think the kind of culture that I was trying to adumbrate, no doubt a bit one-dimensionally at times, because the picture is always more complicated. The picture of any culture is more complicated than you can paint of it. But nonetheless, the picture that I was trying to set out is one in which the who is disappearing into the what. Was that?
Yeah, that's. I was going to interrupt you to say that we have time for one more question. Should I go ahead and take that?
Sure.
In the middle. There's the microphone's coming. Yeah. Right here.
Yeah.
Is it on? Yeah.
Yeah.
I very much admired your talk about the culture of exposure and the sense of the self as deeper than a deep self that Freud puts forward. I'm also interested, though, in what you think about the criticism of psychoanalysis and the whole therapeutic ethos, which Freud isn't responsible for the therapeutic ethos, but the very method of the talking cure and the idea that we should examine in great, great depth, even though it's in the privacy of an office with an analyst, things that people used to think needed to be covered up by reticence. That reticence becomes, in light of psychoanalysis and psychological theory, partly a guilty cover-up, and in fact a psychoanalysis, but much more the therapeutic ethos that emerged from it, has led to an idea that any kind of secret is some kind of repression. So it interests me so tremendously that you have this idea about exposure and your interest in what is your practice as a psychoanalyst.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I recognize that there might be something unexpected about this picture of psychoanalysis, and I think you're absolutely right. I think there was an immediate generation of psychoanalysts who saw themselves as heroic, well, to use Freud's word, as conquistadors of the privacy of the self, who would overcome the shame associated with having a private self and bring all those secrets into the light. So one could see psychoanalysis absolutely as continuous with a culture of exposure. Now, I guess here, I mean, my affiliations in the history of psychoanalysis I think of as being quite eclectic, but this is where I feel quite strongly identified with the British psychoanalytic tradition, because one of the things that's really important about it is its emphasis on the maintenance and cultivation of the setting, which can often seem pedantic. You know, why does it matter whether you keep time 1 minute early, 1 minute late? What does it matter? Why does it matter that the room and the physical setting of the consulting room should be so important? Now, it's important precisely because there is an appreciation that what we're doing in getting people to talk to us is actually something that very easily shades into intrusion, into violation, into a demand that the person in front of us reveal some secrets which are bad for them. And so I think what the emphasis on the setting tries to do is shift the burden away from the revelation of secrets and towards providing a space in which the patient can discover what it is they want to tell us. And so really it recognizes the intrinsically coercive dimension of transference. the intrinsically coercive dimension of getting somebody to talk to you. And it tries to do all kinds of things, all kinds of checks and balances in a way, to put in the way of a coercive understanding of the environment, and to create a kind of a receptive, I mean, to pick up on Anne Lauterbach's term before, to convey the sense of a receptive environment in which anything can come from anywhere, and there's no sort of circumscription or judgment of what is said.
Great. I'm being told that we have time for one more question from a student this time. In the middle, in gray. Yeah. Stand up.
Thank you, Ms. Cohen, for your talk. It was very intriguing and very illuminating. Now, there is a cultural observance of the need to express oneself through social media and through the way that we express ourselves to society. Now, could one not make the argument that this is a continuous habit that is not necessarily new, but is just being introduced through a new medium of trying to keep up appearances with society, friends, and family, and so could not one say, this is nothing new than trying to make your car shine brighter than it actually is?
Yeah, you could say that. The thing is that that kind of status anxiety was itself kind of circumscribed by the fact that you couldn't be doing it every time, all the time, in all places. The wish to have your car shine better than the guy next door doesn't define you. Hopefully, it wouldn't be the beginning and end of your sense of self-definition. Whereas I think when that version of yourself, that externalized version of yourself, insinuates itself into every dimension of communication, into all the spaces that you occupy, it does become defining. If one gives the example of the adolescent bedroom, yes, the adolescent bedroom in a way has always been a space of anxiety in which you try and cultivate a version of oneself which would meet with the approval, the admiration, the envy of peers. On the other hand, that admiration and envy, I think, was once, it had something to do with cultivating your singularity. It had something to do with a sense that what might be admired is your independence and your willingness to follow your own path. And I feel like now there is a kind of anxious pressing towards compliance, and that is the way in which young people understand themselves to be asked to define themselves, although of course they don't and won't always, because it's not always that simple.
When was there this focus on singularity in the adolescent bedroom?
In my adolescence.
Okay. That sounds good.
Yeah.
All right.
That was great. It was great.
Thanks a lot.